This week, Conflict Zone is in New York, just days after Donald Trump was elected president in one of the biggest political upsets this country has seen in decades. And if the campaign rhetoric is anything to go by, those upsets are just beginning. My guest is David Petraeus, former US commander in Iraq and former director of the CIA. Where does America go from here? David Petraeus, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Good to be with you, Tim. Thanks.
You said the day after the election of Donald Trump that you gave him credit for saying he'd try to bind the wounds of division and be the president for all Americans, which is what they all say, I guess. How is anybody supposed to ever believe a word Donald Trump says after the kind of campaign we've seen?
Well, you don't have to believe everything. You just have to see what's going to happen. I think that's really the question anyway. You know, look, with every presidential candidate, there's always that moment when presidential campaign rhetoric has to turn into presidential policy. And that's, I think, what we're all waiting to see.
But this is a campaign that ran on lies, didn't it? And it ran on quite significant lies, in particular the one that sought to delegitimize America's first black president, saying that he hadn't actually been born in the US when it was quite clear that he had. This went on for years. This is serious lying, isn't it?
Well, this has been a very, very, very divisive campaign. And my advice is that he's got to take steps to rebuild the center. He's right to criticize Washington over its partisanship and inability to forge compromises.
He was right to run a racist campaign.
He's a deal maker, and let's see now if he can make some deals in Washington.
He ran a racist campaign, General.
Tim, I'm nonpartisan.
I understand that. But I'm asking you how you work.
The campaign is over, Tim.
But this wasn't a campaign. This is the man, isn't it? The man ran a racist campaign. How do you get over that and work with somebody like that, with views like that? A man who's
by seeing what his actions are. And let's now watch that. That's what matters. We've had divisive campaigns in the past. This country has been through some very, very difficult moments. The question is what happens now? And I'm not going to get into characterizations of this candidate or that candidate. Let's see what President Trump does. Let's see who President-elect Trump picks for his cabinet officials. Let's see what policies begin to emerge. So
it doesn't shock you that 60 million Americans voted for someone who had lied so comprehensively to them during the campaign? What does that say?
Well, let me tell you let me tell you what the election says, and that is that the Washington elite, if you will, the elite of the coasts, New York and LA, have lost touch with an awful lot of America, the so-called flyover zones, the heartland. And that's what came out and voted in droves. That is what had legitimate concerns that were tapped into by a campaign that was very, very effective.
Look, and the 60 million Americans don't care that they were lied to comprehensively during the course of the campaign.
You'll have to ask the 60 million Americans.
But you're not shocked by that?
Tim, we're here to talk about foreign policy, not about this stuff. So let's get into that and see where we go with that.
Well, let's look at some of the comments that you made. You wrote in May that you were increasingly concerned about inflammatory comments in the public arena about Muslims and about calls for blanket discrimination on the basis of religion. This is what you wrote. That's to say Donald Trump's calls. Why did this worry you so much?
Because if you're fighting against Islamic extremists, you have to have Muslim partners. Let's remember, in fact, this is an existential threat for Islamic countries. This is more of a clash within a civilization than it is a clash between civilizations. And our successes, you know, I spent the better part of a decade deployed in the fight against Islamic extremists and insurgents and so forth. You have to have Muslim partners to take them on, and indeed many of our successes have featured that kind of cooperation.
You called these comments toxic and non-biodegradable, a kind of poison that once released into our body politic is not easily expunged. Well, we now know that poison, that intolerance, found a pretty welcome home in America. So how do you expunge it now?
Well, again, this is what I talked about earlier about now starting to forge a new center. Again, the center in Washington really was diminished over the past decade or so. That's why legislation has not been possible. That's why We had to have nonsensical policies such as sequestration, where if the Congress couldn't get together and do its job and agree on budgets that met certain caps, that you had this alternative, which is automatic cuts. It's an insane way of doing business. And so, in fact, my first hope would be that one of the steps that this new administration, of course, let's remember now you have a Republican in the White House and Republicans controlling both houses of Congress. There is no excuse now that the Republicans can offer if they are unable to pass budgets, if they're unable to do away with sequestration.
You believe you can get to this new center, can you, after a poisonous campaign, a man who said the vote was going to be rigged, who incited hatred of the press, who had a history of talking about seizing women's genitals? You believe you can reach a new center with this man?
That's what my advice is. Again,
a president endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan. They're actually holding a victory rally for him.
These are all concerning. Tim, I wrote about this. Don't get me wrong. I am keenly aware of
the challenges
of this campaign. I am keenly aware of this. I am a realistic man, and what I want to see now in reality is steps taken to reassure those who did not support him and to bring together a coalition. This is an individual who's a political outsider. Perhaps he can do something in Washington the political insiders he rightly criticized for being unable to do, and that is actually come together to give a little to gain a lot for our country. This is about compromise on Capitol Hill and together with the White House, and let's see what he can do.
You obviously are concerned about his comments about NATO. He called it obsolete, said the U.S. allies shouldn't benefit from U.S. protection unless they pay what's required of them. Do you share that view, and are you worried now for the state of NATO?
Well, I'm a big believer in coalitions. I was privileged to be a NATO commander at the 4-star level.
But are you worried now
at the 3-star level? Let me answer a couple of questions here, Tim, before you keep interrupting me, please.
But I want to get back to the question about NATO.
Okay.
Given that Trump called it obsolete, are you worried that NATO is not going to survive Trump's presidency?
I'm not worried about that. What I am worried about is that the cooperation and the working together that has characterized this alliance, which is so important now, given various threats around the world, that could be eroded. Now, let me say, by the way, once again, he has been on to something that is legitimate. Secretary Gates, in his final session with the North Atlantic Council, I was there as the commander of the forces in Afghanistan, said to all of them, you are not paying your fair share. You're not meeting the 2% of GDP threshold in your defense spending. Now, that has improved a bit in recent years because of some of the threats that are emerging in various places. But this coalition matters. It's a cornerstone of American security policy. It's a cornerstone of the Western world's security policy. So again, I'm hopeful that the element of his comments that is correct, that others need to do more, that they need to bear more of the burden, that they will step up to that. And indeed, we can forge a continued cooperative effort as we go forward.
And what about the nuclear deal with Iran, which he said he'd rip up as well?
Well, I've seen actually already clarifications of what it is that he would intend, and I have advice there. I think far more important than tinkering with a deal that was agreed by a multilateral group would be to get together between the White House and the Congress and declare a national policy that Iran will never be allowed to enrich uranium to weapons grade, and then to get into—
Which is what the administration said, essentially, hasn't it?
It has not said that. There's never been a statement of U.S. policy that Iran will never be allowed to enrich to weapons. I'm talking about Congress and the White House together. A statement of policy.
You think you can get that?
Again, we have one party in power right now. There's no excuse for that from the Republican side.
If they want to.
So again, if the concern is Iran eventually, because of course the deal has some positive elements and it has some negative elements. All of the medium enriched uranium is out of the country, 99% of the low enriched uranium. The plutonium path to the bomb is ended with cement poured into that reactor core. There's reasonably intrusive inspections regimes. The downsides, it's 10 to 15 years and it ends, and Iran is re-engaged in the global economy in a way that helps them generate much more revenue, some of which is used by nefarious elements like the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force funding Hezbollah, Hamas, and the murderous Bashar al-Assad regime.
Okay, you
Now,
think it's a good deal and it's worth saving?
I didn't say that it's a good deal and it's worth saving. I said that it has positive elements and it has negative elements, and I don't think that undoing the deal is as important as actually the White House and the Congress working together to have a statement of national policy that is very clear that Iran will never be allowed to enrich uranium to weapons grade, and then to work with our Gulf state partners and our ally Israel in the region to counter the malign Iranian activities that are ongoing, because that's the real issue.
Okay.
Iran is living up to the deal. By and large, there's a little more heavy water there right now. They'll get rid of that.
It's exceeded it twice.
Yeah.
The limits twice.
Pretty modest levels. This is not something that would cause me to lose sleep at night. What is causing concern is the continued missile program, the continued funding, training, and equipping of militia elements that are causing considerable unrest in various countries.
Okay, the Obama administration leaves behind the deal, but it also leaves behind a lot of critical issues, doesn't it? It leaves behind a resurgent Russia. We're seeing increased espionage, subversion, cyber warfare, increasingly aggressive maneuvers in the air and at sea, a Syrian dictator in power accused of war crimes, responsibility for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, and a worsening security situation in Afghanistan. There's a large gap here.
You left out some other pieces, like increased tension in the South China Sea.
Absolutely, I didn't want to go through the whole list
program.
Because it would probably take us to
There's
the
no
end
shortage of challenges around the world.
But there's also a large gap between US rhetoric and action, isn't there? And isn't that part of the problem that's being now exploited?
There is no question that there have been statements that weren't followed up on, and that is not a wise way of going forward. The red line that was not a red line, however good the ultimate
over chemical weapons
in Syria, no matter how good the ultimate outcome with, say, 90-95% of those weapons taken out, but enabled by Russia, Vladimir Putin does for us what our own Congress and the British House of Parliament was not going to support. That was very damaging. There are other issues. In fact, what Trump is going to have to do, again, to come back to the future rather than the past, is to navigate between what we have seen from the U.S. over the course of the last 10, 15 years, and that is at times overextension, and then at other times a reluctance to engage. Either of those has downsides, as we have seen, and President Trump is going to have to navigate something in the center. Again, you keep coming back to how can you rebuild the center for domestic policies and indeed for foreign and security policies.
Nothing perhaps has done more damage to the U.S. reputation abroad than its military campaigns in Iraq. One of your former advisors, David Kilcullen, who became chief strategist in the Office of the Coordinator of Counterterrorism, big title, he called the war effing stupid, and he was reprimanded by Condoleezza Rice for it. He described the invasion as the biggest strategic screw-up since the invasion of Russia by Hitler in 1941. He's right, isn't he?
I will never offer a kind of comment on that because as the commander of the surge, the commander of two other elements in Iraq over the years, nearly 4 years, I wrote more letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers than any other general officer. And I am never going to get into the comment on the policy, whether we should or should not have done that. I've certainly
But hasn't that made you bitter?
I have certainly made comments about policies within that overall policy, the firing of the military without telling them what their future was, de-Baathification without reconciliation. These created hundreds of thousands of Iraqi citizens who had an incentive to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it. So I've not hesitated to comment on the individual policies, but I'm not going to ever offer a comment on whether we should or should not have done Iraq. I was a soldier, I executed policies, and I remain a soldier when it comes to not commenting on that one.
But you're still a human being, and you don't feel a sense of bitterness that perhaps you were sent to war on a lie?
We didn't think we were sent to war on a lie. We believed there were chemical or nuclear, whatever weapons there. There's a reason we were wearing our chemical overgarments when we went through the berm into Iraq from Kuwait. Obviously, it turned out to be wrong. It was incorrect intelligence, an intelligence failure, to be sure, but not a lie.
In 2002, the head of British intelligence came back from Washington and told the cabinet in London that the facts and the intelligence were being fixed around the policy. That's to say, the facts and the intelligence were not true. So they knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction.
I don't agree with that. From the U.S. side, I was the executive officer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from 95 to 97. We believed there were weapons of mass destruction. The intelligence community did believe that, whether, again, you can accept it or not, but that was the belief, and that was certainly what we believed when we went through the berm into Iraq in March of 2003.
Even though the weapons inspectors had said they're not there. Hans Blix and his team of UN weapons inspectors.
But look, you can go back and relitigate all of these different issues. You asked for my view on that, and I've given you my view.
Let's talk about the other factor that damaged America's reputation, and that's torture, isn't it? You're on record as saying you're firmly against torture. You wrote the doctrine for interrogation techniques that were fully in line with the Geneva Conventions. You said the best way for an interrogator to extract information is to become a detainee's best friend. Why wasn't that followed by the U.S. in Iraq?
Because of mistakes, frankly. Mistakes, Abu Ghraib and some of these others. These are non-biodegradable to a degree. They may have a half-life, but it's quite a long one. And that's why I have taken that stand. I believe from the very beginning in Iraq, when we sat down, when we realized that a number of our units were going to have to hold detainees far longer than we ever thought. And there's no recent war in which the U.S. held large numbers of detainees. And in the 101st Airborne Division, we sat down and said, you know, there's only one standard we know, that's the Geneva Convention, and that's what we're going to follow. And in fact, we had no issues in the 101st. And when I was privileged to command later on as the multinational force commander in Iraq during the surge, you may recall I actually put out a memo that was titled Living Our Values. And in it, I wrote that the enemy may do horrific things to us, but we are not going to sink to their level. We know that there are right and left limits. We visit violence upon the enemy. That is absolutely what we do, but we do it within certain norms. And I've firmly believed in following those norms. And frankly, the experience as well is that, and again, no one was responsible for more detainees during the surge in Iraq. We had the 27,000 Iraqi detainees, and we had several thousand in Afghanistan. And our experience is that the most accurate information from a detainee comes indeed from a very skilled interrogator speaking the language and dialect, understanding the enemy's architecture, if you will, and establishing rapport with that individual, becoming his best friend.
I understand that, but at the same time, torture was used in hundreds of cases by Iraqis who were monitored by U.S. forces, wasn't it? Torture of Iraqi against Iraqi. I mean, one of your advisors...
In fact, that's why, when I came back as a four-star, because we started seeing this...
Can I just finish the question?
No, let me actually... Now, you've cut me off. I'll cut you off. In fact, when I came back as the multinational force Iraq commander, I insisted that Prime Minister Maliki fire individuals that we learned had been involved in that, indeed towards the tail end of the time that I was doing the train and equip mission.
Okay,
and these were every single member of the Iraqi police forces, the 3-star, both 2-stars, all of the brigadiers, and some 60% of the battalion commanders. We insisted on replacing before I would agree to reconstitute those units. So we were very concerned about that, but it took us a while to sort it out.
But one of your advisors, retired Colonel James Kaufman, who worked in detention centers that were set up with American money, torture occurred in this, and the Iraqi general, Muntada al-Samari, said that he had witnessed torture, that Kaufman and his colleague, James Steele, knew everything that was going on in these detention centers, the torture, the most horrible kinds of torture. Did they communicate that to you?
No,
was going on?
And I was not aware of that.
And if not, why not?
I mean, would you communicate that to your boss if you were doing something wrong?
Well, you're the occupying power. You were responsible for these centers. General oversight of these centers, weren't they? Wouldn't your advisor tell you?
Well, now let me tell you that I did have advisors come to me certainly, and did lay this out without question. And that is why, as I said, when I went back as a 4-star, I presented this, first of all, this is in the tail end of my 15.5-month tour as a 3-star. And toward the end of that time, we started getting this. And so we actually finally got documentation of this, now not involving Kaufman and Steele, but this is Iraqis that had their version of black sites, if you will, in Baghdad and other places. And I took that into the then acting prime minister, Ayat Alawi, and also to the multinational force commander at the time, General George Casey. And then, as I said, when I came back as a 4-star, what I did was took action by insisting that all these individuals be replaced before we would reconstitute those units.
But we had
enormous leverage at that point in time.
But there was a well-established procedure, wasn't there? There was FRAGO 242 and 039, which directed that Iraqi on Iraqi abuse be reported through operational channels.
And it was. What I was saying,
provided the initial report confirms U.S. forces were not involved in detainee abuse, no further investigation will be conducted unless directed by HHQ. So it was an instruction to look the other way, wasn't it?
Not in my view, no. And I'm not sure what the FRAGO is, or if multinational force, or who it is that issued that FRAGO. I can tell you that when I was the commander in Iraq as the 4-star,
it was issued to American soldiers.
We took action. When I was the commander, we took action on this. We did not permit it, and we insisted on the replacement of those who were engaged in it.
In 2014, President Obama said, we tortured some folks. He came out in the White House, he said, we tortured some folks. Huge admission by the commander-in-chief, but where were the prosecutions?
There were prosecutions, as I recall. And again, you're going to have to go to the Department of Justice or the experts on that kind of stuff. But again, all one can do is be responsible for when you are the commander. And when I was the commander in Iraq overall, indeed when I was the commander as a 2-star as well, and a 3-star, although that was a train and equip mission, and then as a commander as a 4-star in Afghanistan, we worked very, very hard to ensure that this did not take place, and we took action when it did.
Obama went on to add, strangely, that it was important not to feel too sanctimonious about all this because intelligence officials who tortured detainees were working during a period of extraordinary stress. So is the takeaway that if you're having a bad day, it's okay to torture people? Is that?
Of course not.
Why this understanding? Why this finessing of torture?
I do
it's
think
against the law, isn't it?
I do think it is worth recalling context in certain cases. And the context in which some of this did take place was a context of having had 3,000 of our citizens killed in the most horrific terrorist attacks in U.S. history, and a sense at that time, as I understand it also, that it was a strategic ticking time bomb scenario. In other words, that there was more of this, worse of this, coming. And
but laws are there for the bad times,
they are.
They?
Look, I'm with you. You're preaching to the choir here. And my record as the commander in Iraq, as the commander in Afghanistan, I think stands up to scrutiny in this regard.
Given that our governments lie to us, intelligence agencies lie to us, there is a place for whistleblowers. And my question to you is, given that you were prosecuted for mishandling classified information, shouldn't there be a kinder approach to people who have leaked information to WikiLeaks or given information in the public interest? Shouldn't America have toned down its criticism of people who've done that?
Well, it depends if there was a deliberate effort to get that out into the public, if there was damage done from it.
Edward Snowden,
Snowden cannot be presented as, he deliberately put sources and methods of enormous value, as well as international relationships, in enormous jeopardy.
But the previous Attorney General said he'd done a public service.
That is not that's not my view of that.
Eric Holder actually performed
well,
the
I think
public
you're
service.
taking this out of context, because Holder also says that Holder does not pull punches about the damage that was done. Holder's, I think, but again, you can ask Holder. Again, my view is that he, in hugely egregious ways. Look, what I did was share something that was never revealed. It was to get dates, not for all the other stuff in there. It was a mistake. I acknowledged it. I have paid my dues for that. There's leakers all the time. If there's damaging leaks, we pursued those. And indeed, you should.
We wouldn't need them if governments told the truth, though, would we, General?
Well, again, there are certain things that it is okay not to say. I'm not saying that government lied about what our intelligence agencies were doing, but they were not going to tell the enemy that we had certain capabilities that enabled us to monitor various of their communications means or that kind of stuff.
Good to have you on Conflict Zone, General. Thanks, you very much indeed.
You bet.
Thank you.